people are beginning to imagine what form a new government might take. Abigail Adams writes to her husband.
Dearest friend, in the new laws which you will be writing, please remember the ladies. Don't put unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if you give them a chance. If you don't pay attention to the ladies, then you cannot expect us to obey any laws in which we don't have a voice or representation.
Well, well. We were warned that our struggle with England is going to let everyone loose. Children are going to become disobedient. Students will overthrow their teachers. Negroes and Indians will become insolent to their masters. But now I see a new tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the others, is beginning to rebel.
Dearest friend, I'm sorry, but I still find it odd that while you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating the nation, you still insist on retaining the absolute power of husbands over their wives. Remember, John, arbitrary power, like everything else that's hard and brittle, is easily broken. In spite of all your wise laws, we too have it in our power to free ourselves.
Throughout the colonies, royal governors are under attack. They can get no support from the British Army, which is concentrated in Massachusetts. Except in Boston, power is soon largely in the hands of local patriots. In one colony after another, a new flag is flying. It has 13 stripes, but the Union Jack is still in the corner. With all that has happened, the colonists continue to see themselves as British subjects. The Continental Congress had been called as an ad hoc committee, but it has become a government almost by accident. Its members now find themselves running a fledgling army, advising the states on setting up governments, building roads, and running the post office. But the delegates still cannot bring themselves to take the final step.
Like the proverbial Mrs. Bickle, we tremble on our wedding night. But at least Mrs. Bickle realizes that there's no turning back. She musters up her spirits, commits her soul to Jesus and her body to Mr. Bickle, and leaps into bed.
In March 1776, Congress receives startling news. The British have evacuated Boston and are regrouping for a massive invasion of New York City. General Washington rushes to New York to set up defenses. The moment cannot be put off any longer. The time has come to make a formal declaration of independence from England. The delegates know that this is also a declaration of war.
All of them felt that their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, as they said, on the record, all those were at stake. I think they meant it. I think they thought they would probably die, and if they didn't die, that they would be disgraced in some way that made the stakes very, very high for them.
To prepare the declaration, the delegates appoint a committee, including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. One member is a man who has not spoken one word in Congress, a shy planter and sometime architect, Thomas Jefferson. When it comes to actually writing the final document, Adams defers to Jefferson.
First reason, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Second reason, I am obnoxious and unpopular. You are well liked. Third reason, you can write 10 times better than I can.
Borrowing ideas from English philosophers, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the spirit of Tom Paine, Jefferson writes the first draft in a day.
I see my job as trying to bring together and harmonize a variety of different opinions. We are putting before all of mankind, in words that are both simple and firm, a justification for the stand that we're being forced to take.
After long debate, Congress changes much of the document, but leaves untouched Jefferson's stirring preamble. He has taken what was to be a simple declaration of the colony's independence from England and turned it into something that will change the world forever.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Declaration of Independence was obviously more than a simple separation of these 13 states from the British monarchy. Its preface expressed sentiments that have become the basis of all of our beliefs. Equality lay at the heart of their endeavor. It's equality of not paying attention to whom you married, who your father was, who your patron was. This renunciation of this kind of hierarchical world lay at the heart of the revolution. Now, the implications of that, they hadn't fully seen. Many, of course, had no sense that all men and women are equal, nor did they think that all white men and black men are equal. But nonetheless, they do posit this notion of equality, which turns out to be a very permissive doctrine and can be picked up by hosts of people who would use it in ways that many of these revolutionary leaders never anticipated.
The War of the American Revolution was not the first war about ideas, because after all there'd been many wars of religion, and these were essentially about ideas, about philosophies. But I think the War of Independence I think it ended as the first truly political war. It may not have begun so. It may have been about other things, about taxes or about indirect rule from London. It may have been about grievances, but it became a war about ideas. Once they declared their independence, and once they started to think about the future form that the United States would take, once they began to see America, the America that was going to be, as different from the Europe that was, then it became a political war, and ended, of course, by being, I think, a completely political war. America was going to be independent, but it was going to be a new sort of organization, a new sort of state, and there'd never been that in the world before.
On July 2nd, 1776, Congress resolves that the colonies are to be independent from England. 2 days later, on July 4th, the delegates adopt the Declaration of Independence. John Adams makes a prediction to his wife.
The second day of July, 1776, ought to be commemorated by succeeding generations as the Day of Deliverance. It ought to be celebrated by pomp and parade, with shows and games, sports, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Now you'll think that I'm getting carried away with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil, the blood, and the treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth the means. Posterity will triumph in this day's business, even though we may regret it. I trust in God we shall not.
The British must wait 2 months for all their ships and supplies to arrive. Meanwhile, they stage on Staten Island. In the sweltering New York summer, the soldiers train. Led by officers in heavy wool coats and wigs, they parade in full battle dress. They write home about the heat, the ferocious mosquitoes, and the American women.
The fair nymphs on Staten Island are fresh meat for our men. A girl cannot step into the bushes to pick a rose without risk of being ravaged. We have the most entertaining court-martials every day.
The British are joined by 8,000 German troops, known as Hessians. With a reputation for being savage fighters, these soldiers are rented from German princes for £7 a head. The British forces are among the biggest, best trained, and toughest armies in the world. They believe Washington's troops will present no serious opposition.
Well, a lot of the generals had been to America because they had been fighting there in the 7 Years' War, in the French and Indian War, and their opinion of colonial troops was on the whole pretty low. They didn't think much of colonial troops, and, you know, who were the senior officers of the colonial militia? Men like Major Washington, who'd surrendered the moment he'd met the French the first time. This was the kind of thing which didn't inspire confidence among experienced professional soldiers, and they tended to take the view that colonial troops were all very well as long as you kept them out of the way of the enemy.
The men who joined the American Army could not be more different from the hardened career soldiers of the British Army. The Americans come with a variety of motives. Some are patriotic. Some are just in search of adventure. A typical soldier is Joseph Plum Martin, a young farmer from Connecticut. In a diary which he will keep for the 7 years of the war, he records the day of his enlistment.
Last year when I saw my friends marching off, I went home, bit my fingernails, imagining them all telling me of their exploits, swaggering home, their hairbreadth escapes. So I took up a pen, made my mark, and joined. You know, they make you sign up for a whole year. I was just hoping to get a priming before I took on the whole coat of paint of a soldier.
The soldiers come from all over. The sovereign state of Maryland, the plantations of Virginia, and the wilderness of New Hampshire. Many young men have never been away from home. They are meeting people from other states for the first time in their lives.
You know, they put me in this regiment, half New Englanders and half Pennsylvanians. There's folks as different as night and day. And myself, I'd rather be fighting with a tribe of Indians than with these Southerners. I mean, the foreigners can hardly speak English. They don't like me either. And they call me that damn Yankee. That's about the nicest thing they say.
One has to remember that in 1776, Americans are not in any way one nation yet. In fact, most people would have thought of their nation, if they talked in those terms, or of their country, as Virginia or Connecticut or Massachusetts, and their loyalties were to their province, which had, each of them had its own long history. And I think that was a question that a lot of people wondered in 1776 about the term American. Just how American are they, and whether they weren't Virginians and Massachusetts and Connecticut people first.
The general has heard that jealousies have arisen among the troops from the different provinces. Name-calling, which causes irritation and can only serve to hurt the noble cause in which we are all engaged. The provinces are all united to oppose a common enemy. All distinctions must be sunk in the name American. George Washington.
Washington's goal is to forge a united and professional army. He is fiercely determined that the British see him as a general worthy of the name. In 18th century terms, that also means being a proper gentleman.
There's no character in the Revolution who is so obsessed with doing what was proper, what the best people thought was the right thing to do. One of his first books that he owned was, and that he copied out assiduously at the age of 16, were rules of etiquette from a courtesy manual. Washington is a man of intense self-will, very quick to anger, but he controlled it. Almost his whole career is an act of will. The reason he behaved the way he did, sometimes in a wooden-like fashion, was because he was trying to live up to what he saw was the ideal classical image of a hero.
Of course, a great part of the problem was that the British had not treated the American officers like gentlemen before the war, when they had been mere provincial officers. And it's often said that if only the British had made George Washington a regular colonel in the armed forces of the Crown, he wouldn't have been a revolutionary at all. Indeed, might have been fighting energetically to put the rebellion down.
Washington hates following a strategy of retreat. But he knows that the Continental Army must be preserved at all costs. Along with Congress, the Army is America's only national institution, the glue that holds the country.
You stand guard for an hour or two, or you're under attack from the enemy and you have to march another 5 miles.
Joseph Plum Martin cannot wait to go home. His enlistment will be up in 2 months, along with all the rest of the Army. Recruiting posters go up everywhere.
To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men, take notice. Those who may favor this recruiting party with their attendance will have the opportunity of spending a few happy years in viewing the different parts of this beautiful continent in the honorable and truly respectable character of a soldier, after which he may return home to his friends with his pockets full of money and his head covered with laurels. God save the United States.
But a losing general will attract few new enlistments. And Washington has already lost Long Island, New York City, and much of Westchester. Washington proposes something new, offering money and land to recruit soldiers for long-term enlistments. John Hancock replies to Washington.
Sir, Congress is resolved to help you in the present critical state of our affairs. In order to give you all possible assistance in keeping the Army together, Congress has appointed a committee. With every sentiment of esteem and respect, your very humble servant, John Hancock.
Congress can do very little beyond forming committees. All political power remains with the individual states. Congress has no authority to tax, no way of raising money to supply or pay the Army.
Washington spent a very frustrating war, there's no doubt about it, in many ways. And among the greatest of his frustrations was dealing with Congress, a Congress that could not meet his basic needs, that could not even guarantee him an army that would be there a year from now, a Congress that periodically dissolved. And yet, Washington was so committed to the rule of civilian authority over the military that he was willing to absorb those blows, to deal with those frustrations. It is a measure of Washington's character, political skill, and I would say idealism, that he could put up with this Congress and never lose sight of the larger objective.
The Americans have one stronghold left on the whole of Manhattan, Fort Washington. The fort holds most of the heavy artillery of the Continental Army. The Americans are convinced that the fort is impregnable. But the British smash its defenses in one brilliantly coordinated attack. The capture of the precious stores in Fort Washington is a disaster for the Americans. Over 100 cannon, thousands of muskets, and 400,000 cartridges. These are all manufactured in England, and the Americans have no hope of replacing them. The British follow up with an attack on Fort Lee on the other side of the Hudson River. Washington watches the fall of the two forts. 3,000 American soldiers are dead or captured. It is the tragic finale to a 3-month string of catastrophes.
To John Augustine Washington, if I were to put a curse on my worst enemy, it would be to wish him in my position now. I just do not know what to do. It seems impossible to continue my command in this situation. But if I withdraw, all will be lost.
The front has moved to New Jersey. General Howe now gives the Americans another chance to surrender with honor. He offers New Jersey citizens a royal pardon if they will renounce the rebel cause. In just 2 weeks, 3,000 Americans accept the offer, including a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
There are a lot of Americans who think it is time to give up in late 1776, that they've made the best effort they could, but that the British Army, with the British Navy behind it and the British economy behind that, are just simply too strong.
December 1776. All of New Jersey is now in the hands of the British, who are garrisoned along the northern bank of the Delaware River, 30 miles from Philadelphia. Congress has fled to Baltimore. General Howe declares the war over for the winter. It is common in the 18th century to avoid fighting in winter. Armies face impassable roads, perilous half-frozen rivers, disease and starvation. Animals are a particular problem.
A human being is tougher, much tougher, than a horse or even an ox. A human being can go longer without food as long as he has water than an animal can. An 18th century army finds it very difficult to do anything in those months when there's no grass in the fields, no fodder for the horses. You can't feed the animals.
General Howe, comfortably settled in New York City, has begun the elegant winter season of balls and banquets. The talk of the town is about an affair he is having with a certain Mrs. Loring, the wife of one of his officers. Washington has retreated from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. It has turned bitterly cold. His soldiers have no tents and little winter clothing.
No food for 2 days. Pinched with hunger. I come across an oxtail that somehow escaped the dogs. I steer off to my tent with this prize, where I throw it on the fire and broil it. It's not long in my stomach before it starts to show a great inclination to be set at liberty again. I become more and more willing to listen to its requests. And with tears at parting with what I thought was my friend, I give it a discharge. It's a while before I'll eat oxtail again.
Washington himself is now engaged in a personal battle for survival. Among the Army's top generals, there is open talk of replacing him.
Washington's attitude in late 1776 is one more of desperation than anything else. He's thinking that probably he'd be better send instructions back to his own estate and make provisions for the British winning the war. So there's not much on his mind except survival well into the month of December in 1776. Things look really bad, very bad indeed.
To John Augustine Washington, I have begged Congress again and again to send me soldiers with long-term enlistments. All I get back is delays and quarrels. Then the state send me officers who aren't fit to polish boots. John, I'm sick to death of what is going on. Every day things get worse. Congress botches things up, and I get blamed.
We have a report from an informant close to Washington's family. The general looks extremely dejected. He spends much of his time alone. People who have walked in on him found him in tears. His army has no blankets, none of the necessities of life. They're even out of salt. I have corroborated these facts with other informants.
Christmas is approaching. John Hancock sends Washington a gift, a barrel of his wife's salted fish.
To John Hancock, my grateful thanks for the salted fish. I'm very fond of salted fish, but never think of it until it is placed before me. I hope you have not gone to too much trouble sending it to camp on my account. My compliments to Mrs. Hancock. George Washington.
The fate of the United States now rests on Washington and 6,000 men. The first army in modern history to be fighting for a political ideal is facing its darkest moment. Traveling with the weary, exhausted soldiers is Tom Paine, the brilliant British writer whose pamphlet Common Sense had convinced many Americans to embrace independence. On a drumhead, he writes one of the most quoted essays in the English language. It is called The American Crisis. Washington immediately orders all of his officers to read it to their troops. He hopes its words will inspire them to hold on for just a little longer.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country.
But they that stand it now deserve the love and thanks of men and women.
Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. But the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
Heaven knows how to put a proper price on its goods. It would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
I fear nothing. I see no cause of fear. In the end, we will be the victors. For though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the ember will never expire.
It is just before Christmas. The soldiers' terms of enlistment will be up on December 31st. In 1 week, Washington will be a general without an army. Across the Delaware River from the Americans, in the small town of Trenton, New Jersey, the Hessian Colonel Johann Rall and his brigade prepare to celebrate the holidays. Rall is in high spirits. He gives little thought to the American forces camped just across the river.
We don't need trenches or fortifications. The rebel soldiers, those country clowns, they're almost naked, dying of cold, have no provisions, no blankets. Let them come. We shall welcome them with our bayonets.
Washington decides to risk all his troops in a surprise offensive. Horses and cannon and the remains of his army will cross the half-frozen Delaware River in the middle of the night and launch an attack on the Hessian camp at Trenton. It's his last roll of the dice. All or nothing.
The key is absolute secrecy. We do not really have enough men for the task, but we have no choice. Coordinate with Griffin and attack on as many of their posts as possible. The more confusion we can spread, the better.
December the 23rd, new orders. We are moving out with 3 days' rations. General Washington has just given the password for this operation. Victory or death.
The plan is to move 2,500 men and 18 field guns across the river. It seems impossible. It's cold and stormy. Ice is floating in the river. The troops march to the boats in the most profound silence.
Christmas, 3 a.m. All the troops have crossed the river and the boats have gone back for the artillery. I've never seen Washington so determined. He stands on the bank of the river, wrapped in his cloak, overseeing the landing of his troops, calm and collected.
We begin our march to Trenton. The horses pulling the cannon slip and slide. They're without shoes. So are the soldiers. The road to Trenton is literally marked with the blood of the soldiers' feet.
A great commotion near the meeting house. A Hessian running out from the house, yelling in German. 3 or 4 others come out with their guns. Bullets whistle over our heads.
The surprise is complete. Rahl and his regiment are drunk and asleep. By the time they realize what is happening, the trap has sprung.
The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy is a scene out of the Final Judgment. They try to form lines in the streets, but our howitzers are already in place. They run behind the houses to hide, but we go after them with muskets.
Commander Rahl tumbles from his horse. His soldiers throw down their guns. We take 1,200 prisoners.
Colonel Rahl, who was, he was a great fighter, but he was also a great drinker and a great braggart. It's interesting that Christmas night, he was at a party, and a man came to the door to see him. He said, "It's very urgent, I've got to see him, let him know." And Rahl wouldn't bother seeing him. So finally the man wrote a note, and they gave it to Rahl. And they found it in his pocket after he died 2 days later. And it said, "The Americans are coming to attack you tomorrow morning." He never bothered to read it.
The victory at Trenton is a startling reversal of fortune. Washington follows up with the defeat of a British brigade in the town of Princeton, 10 miles away. Suddenly, the whole psychological picture of the war has changed.
Actually, Trenton is a small skirmish. The British generals, who read their comment at the time, they're saying, how tiresome. But they don't regard it as being that serious in itself. You know, these things happen in war.
Well, in military terms, it isn't a big deal. You lost 1,000 Germans, but you can always go hire another 1,000 Germans. But it's extremely important on the American side. As the news spreads to all the colonies, there is a feeling that it may indeed be possible to reverse the course of this war.
New Jersey civilians who had signed a loyalty oath to the king come back to supporting the revolution. Volunteers from all 13 states are rushing to fill the ranks of the dwindling army. And Washington, whose very command had been in doubt only a few days before, now becomes a national hero.
This Washington is certainly a most surprising man, a natural-born general. The fact that this Negro-driving plantation owner can muster together some ragged beggars, the refuse of other nations, and keep England's most experienced soldiers at bay is, well, astonishing. Our country's finest chased by a tobacco planter. Poor old England, how thy laurels have tarnished.
From that point, he seems to be able to do no wrong. Washington
after these two little military victories, seems to exemplify the revolution. He is the revolution.